Today I'm with Dr. David Cavan, the author of Reverse Your Diabetes. David, hello.
Hello.
Now, how old were you when you first became interested in diabetes?
I was a medical student, so I was in my early 20s, and my interest was sparked because my first experience of working on a ward with real patients was working with a diabetes team. I was very lucky that the senior members of the team were very, very good. They're very good teachers and very, very enthusiastic about the subject. They inspired me, and that has remained with me ever since.
And can you explain to me the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes, because this book is very significantly for type 2 diabetes?
Absolutely. Type 1 diabetes is a condition whereby the cells in the pancreas that produce insulin stop working, and they stop working completely. It typically appears first in children or in young adults, and people who have type 1 diabetes need insulin every day to stay alive. Type 2 diabetes is very different. This is a condition where typically the body is able to produce insulin, but the body cannot make good use of it. So insulin's action in keeping the level of glucose in the bloodstream under control does not happen, and it's that causes the blood glucose levels to rise. You're absolutely right, this book is designed specifically for people with type 2 diabetes, and although there may be some things that may be of interest for people with type 1 diabetes, the advice is generally not for them.
So when did you first notice the effect of diet on diabetes?
I think it's fair to say that it's only been in the last 4 or 5 years that I've become aware of the significant impact that changing diet can have on a person with type 2 diabetes. All of the guidelines that I'm aware of for managing diabetes do specify that it's important to address diet and lifestyle factors at the beginning, but almost always that is covered in a very few words right at the top of the guideline, which then goes on to go into a great amount of detail about all the different types of drugs or insulins that could be used. And given that as a doctor one's training is very much focused on prescribing medication, then I think it's fair to say that the focus has been on that rather than on the diet and lifestyle of measures. And certainly that was true for my own case. Now, I began to look at this in more detail when I began to realize that some of the newer treatments for type 2 diabetes that had come along, while they might sometimes be very, very effective, actually sometimes the effect would wear out or it wouldn't work very well at all. And I began to realize that unless the person taking those treatments was also addressing their lifestyle and specifically their diet, then they really wouldn't work. And then the next step was to focus much more on identifying the sort of simple changes that a person with type 2 diabetes could make to achieve better control of their diabetes, which often meant that they actually then didn't need additional medication.
So the management of diabetes is actually very different from the management of many other conditions.
It is, and it is for the simple reason that just about anything you do in your life can have an effect on your diabetes, and diabetes can have an effect on so much that you do in your daily life, that managing diabetes requires the person with diabetes to be considering all the time actually, what do I need to do, what do I need to eat, what will the impact be if I have this, that or the other. So it is a self-management, and that's why it is so critical that the person with diabetes has up-to-date, accurate knowledge and understanding, not only about what diabetes is, type 2 diabetes is, but what they can do, the measures they can take to best control it and to begin to reverse the diabetes disease process.
So you began to question your whole medical training, the premise that medication was the best way to control type 2 diabetes.
Well, indeed, and I think it's probably fair to say that my medical training did identify that lifestyle changes, diet changes were important, but the emphasis was very much on the medications, and certainly the emphasis that I took was very much on medications. And having seen that medications actually didn't, especially some of the newer medications, didn't live up to their original promise, that was really the turning point where I began to question the role of medications, and actually let's look and focus much more on the lifestyle and the dietary factors. That isn't to say that medications don't have a role. They can be very, very useful, but I always say they are there to help the dietary changes They're not there to do it all on their own.
How and why can the progression of diabetes be halted and even reversed by dietary changes?
What we've learnt in recent years, and it is very new knowledge just in the last 5 years or maybe a little bit more, is that significant weight loss can reverse diabetes. Now, this originally came from the observation that people who had bariatric surgery, i.e. gastric operations in order to treat their obesity, if they had diabetes before the operation, very commonly, sometime after the operation, their diabetes had disappeared. And this led to a number of studies which identified that people with type 2 diabetes, if they are able to lose weight, then again, even without surgery, but just by going onto an appropriate diet, the diabetes could be reversed. And what was shown was very specifically that this reversal of diabetes happened at the same time as the level of fats in the liver and the pancreas disappeared. Now, we know that if we put on weight, then we retain fat in our bodies, and just as we can have fat around our middle or under our chin, you can also store fat in the liver and pancreas. And what we now understand is that the accumulation of fat in those organs is a very important part of what causes type 2 diabetes, that if you can lose the weight, then that fat accumulation disappears and the liver and the pancreas begin to work normally again. The fact that that can be achieved by diet alone is really quite transformational. It's transformed our understanding of type 2 diabetes, and it's a message that I think that everyone who's diagnosed with type 2 diabetes should know, should understand, so that they have the opportunity of examining their own diet, their own lifestyle, to see what changes they can make that will help them lose weight and particularly lose the fat from the organs in order to reverse the diabetes disease process.
What difference can this book make?
The aim of the book is to give people with type 2 diabetes as accurately as possible the information that they need in order to understand what changes to their own lifestyle, i.e. the foods they eat, the drinks they drink, the activities they do, what changes they can make to best keep their glucose levels under control, best control their diabetes, and because we now know that it can be reversed, to make some way to reversing the disease process. So my hope is that people will, by buying the book, they'll be able to take on board some of those messages and achieve better control of their diabetes. Of course, I hope that some will actually reverse their diabetes so they no longer have diabetes. I don't make that claim that everyone who reads the book will reverse their diabetes, but what I think is absolutely key is that they have the understanding that I've just explained, that it can be reversed, and these are the sort of things that you can do to try and best ensure you can reverse it as much as you can in your own individual case.
And it's important, isn't it, that any changes to your diabetes treatment are made in consultation with your doctor, as it's dangerous to stop insulin if you suffer from diabetes.
Well, if you have type 1 diabetes, of course, you need insulin for survival. This book is emphatically for people with type 2 diabetes. And yes, some of them will be treated with insulin. If you are treated with insulin and you change your diet quite significantly, you will need to change the amount of insulin you take. And so therefore, it is absolutely important that any changes that you make in terms of your diet, if they're quite significant changes and you are on medication, that has to be discussed with your diabetes team, whether it's the practice nurse or your doctor.
And how is this book different from a self-help book?
That's a good question. In a sense, it is a self-help book because it's designed to provide people with the information that they need in order to help themselves maintain and improve their health. But what I've tried to do is to provide a very comprehensive account of what type 2 diabetes is, the sort of things that can cause it, and using that information then to help people understand the sort of changes they can make to reverse it, to begin to reverse the diabetes disease process. So yes, it is hopefully a self-help book, but I would hope it's much more than that, and will provide a thorough understanding both about diabetes, but also what can be done to try and improve it.
And what are the symptoms of type 2 diabetes, and how is it now diagnosed?
Well, for very many people, they don't have any symptoms when they're diagnosed. It's very, very possible to have slightly raised glucose levels, high enough to make the diagnosis of diabetes, but not high enough to cause you any symptoms. And in this country especially, increasingly it's the case that people are diagnosed because a blood test has been done by their GP, because they've been seen that they could be at risk of diabetes, or because of some other illness where it's been felt that they should be checked for diabetes. So it is not at all uncommon that you can have diabetes without any symptoms at all. If, however, you do get to the stage where your diabetes has not been diagnosed and your glucose levels rise up to a level where they do cause symptoms, then that's the stage at which people get the typical symptoms of being very thirsty, passing a lot of urine, because the passing of urine is the body's way of trying to get rid of the excess glucose in the bloodstream. In order to get rid of that, you need to pass a lot of water. That makes you dehydrated. You therefore become thirsty. Thankfully, those sort of symptoms are less commonly seen nowadays because, as I said, people are diagnosed much easier. The good news is, however, that if you are diagnosed early on, then you're much earlier in the disease process, and it will make it easier for you to be able to make some changes to keep it at that level, to stop it getting any worse, and hopefully to try and reverse it.
Now, in 2010, an Oxford professor, David Matthew, compared the rise in type 2 to the Black Plague in medieval times. So are we really facing a pandemic?
I think we are. In the UK now, it's estimated there are around 3 million people with diabetes, the vast majority of those with type 2 diabetes. Globally, if we look across the world, it's estimated there are now nearly 400 million people with diabetes, and that's estimated to increase to nearly 600 million over the next 20 years. 1 in 12 adults across the world now has diabetes. The words epidemic or pandemic get overused and perhaps lose their meaning sometimes, but we are now in a situation where it is becoming normal to have a condition which, if left untreated, can have devastating health effects, can kill people due to complications that can affect them in the prime of their lives, and really can cause devastation not only for individuals, but because of the sheer numbers of people affected, on whole countries.
Well, we've all heard horror stories of people who are going blind or who have lost both legs because of diabetes. Are these complications inevitable?
Well, they're not at all inevitable, but they can happen. And the tragedy is that the consequences of ignoring your diabetes or of letting glucose levels rise too high are really quite stark. It can lead to blindness, to kidney failure, to heart attacks, and to death. Now, I say those things not to scare people, but because that is the reality. So that's the bad news about diabetes. The good news is that relatively simple changes to your lifestyle can actually have a really big effect and can be part of the process of avoiding those complications and of making sure that for any one individual, they are not inevitable, because they are not inevitable.
Well, you discovered yourself that impaired glucose intolerance, the pre-diabetic condition, could be reversed with a program of diet and exercise.
Indeed, and this followed some big studies that were published internationally in around about 10 to 15 years ago, which did show that if people were identified as having pre-diabetes, either not yet diagnosed as having diabetes, but they're on their way, that if they change their lifestyle, they could be prevented from developing diabetes. And so we replicated this in a very simple program. And what was really very encouraging is, yes, not only were they prevented from developing diabetes, actually within a year, they'd reversed back into having completely normal glucose levels. And this was the beginning of our understanding that the whole process from normal through pre-diabetes to diabetes, that it can be reversed.
Gosh. Is weight loss a way for everyone to reverse their diabetes?
The majority of people nowadays with type 2 diabetes are overweight. Not everyone is obese, but most people are overweight. So weight loss is very, very key to the process of achieving better control and reversing the diabetes disease process. Having said that, there are a number of people who develop type 2 diabetes and who are of normal weight or only very, very slightly overweight. And here the focus will be on a little bit of weight loss, but probably more on changing the composition of their diet so that they're eating specifically a lot less sugar and a lot less refined carbohydrates, because it is thought that these are the foods that can make it more likely to develop diabetes if you are not particularly overweight.
You also recommend that people with diabetes should avoid fruit juices, smoothies and dried fruit. So why is this?
I think one of the tragedies, if you like, over recent years is the way that certain very high sugar foods have been very successfully marketed as being healthy. And within this category are fruit juices and smoothies, which often have more sugar in them than a drink such as a Coca-Cola, the sugary variety. And given that if you have diabetes, then any sugar that you eat or drink will raise your glucose level and make it more difficult for you to keep it under control, then I want people to understand that whatever it might say on the packet about being part of your 5 a day, about being healthy, about being natural sugar, actually it's not going to help your diabetes. And I personally have stopped drinking fruit juice almost completely. I don't like smoothies anyway, and I would advise people, if you can manage without, then it's quite an easy win to make. The point about dried fruit is that in a small quantity it's fine, but if you take a grape and turn it into a sultana, what you've largely done is taken out the water, so the sugar becomes much more concentrated. And if you have a large quantity, it could very easily and quickly push your glucose levels up.
But this isn't a book simply filled with dietary restrictions, is it?
Well, it's not, and I've tried to make it not. What I've tried to do is to identify, or to help the reader identify the few key changes that they can make that can help them on their way. The point is that in getting on control, getting on top of your diabetes, reversing the disease process, losing weight, the changes to your lifestyle have to be permanent. They have to be things that you do for the rest of your life, because if you switch back into old habits, then the weight will just go back on again. So advocating a very extreme diet or a huge number of restrictions just isn't going to work.
One of the most shocking statistics is that 2 hours a day of television increases your risk of diabetes by 20%.
I too was quite shocked when I first uncovered that piece of research, but it's part of an increasing body of research which is showing that modern day lifestyles are increasing our risk of diabetes, and it's not just through the foods that we eat and the drinks that we drink, but it's also the amount of activity that we do or inactivity. And given that so many of us nowadays spend huge amounts of our time sitting down, whether that's watching television or at work on a computer, then it's really revealing to understand that trying to reduce the amount of time sitting down can have a big effect in reducing your risk of diabetes, but also in helping you get on control of it.
Now, how can you monitor the changes that you make to diet and exercise as you go along? In making lifestyle changes, then the key goals, if you have type 2 diabetes, are, if you're overweight, which as we said most are, it's going to be to lose weight, but it's also going to be to ensuring that your glucose levels, the level of glucose in your bloodstream, is as near normal as possible. And the only way of doing that is by doing a test
using a simple home testing kit to check your blood glucose to see what it is. Now, there is a degree of controversy around blood glucose testing in the UK especially, where it's felt that many people with diabetes, with type 2 diabetes, actually don't need to do blood testing. But there's no other way of knowing on a day-to-day basis whether the changes that you're making are having the desired effect. So one piece of advice that I would generally give is if people are trying out a different type of eating or trying a different meal, then in order to see whether their body can cope with it, then doing a blood test just before you eat and then 2 hours afterwards is a very, very good way of ascertaining that what you're eating is helping you keep your glucose levels under control. Not every single time, but the evidence has shown that doing a test before and 2 hours after a meal just once or twice a week can give you enough information to help you build up your skills in learning what you can eat and how much you can eat, and therefore in helping you achieve the goals of better control of your diabetes.
And am I right in thinking these tests are available at diabetes.co.uk?
Yes, indeed.
Information for friends and relatives in this book on page 243 is perhaps the most important few pages of a book I've ever read. So how much difference does the support of friends and family make?
I'm very pleased to hear you say that. It was very important to me that I included a readily identifiable section that the reader could show to their friends or their relative, so that they can, the relative can have an understanding as to what the important changes are that the person with diabetes needs to make. And the reason for doing it is it is of course absolutely essential that if you're living in a household with someone with diabetes, the ability of that person with diabetes to make significant changes to their diets will be hugely dependent on what the other people in the house are doing, especially if you're relying on someone else to do your cooking for you or doing the shopping. I've seen examples of where a person with diabetes has come to clinic and has seen me, and I've suggested changes they can make, and actually they've not been able to make them. And then when I've questioned afterwards, well, my wife does the shopping, my wife does the cooking, she thinks I should be doing this. So I said, well, why don't you bring your wife along next time? And having that conversation was the beginning for that particular person of making the difference.
So other than friends and family, where else can people go to get advice and support?
Well, traditionally one would be able to go to your doctor or your diabetes team, specialist nurse for advice. But of course, with the ever-increasing numbers of people with diabetes, that isn't nowadays quite so easy to arrange and to get the advice or the support at the time that you need it. What has been, I think, a tremendous benefit and advance over recent years has been the development of internet forums, for example, diabetes.co.uk, which gives an opportunity for people with diabetes to share with each other some of their concerns, some of their frustrations, or even just to ask a question about, how to manage a particular aspect of their diabetes. And I think, there's quite a good body of evidence now that even if there isn't someone there who can give you an exact answer, just the fact of sharing your concern or your worry about some aspect of having diabetes can itself be provide a very high degree of support for the individual.
Now, can you explain the term diabetes distress?
Diabetes distress is a relatively recent term that's come about to describe some of the psychological effects that having diabetes can have on a person. A number of studies over the years have shown that people with type 2 diabetes are at increased risk of anxiety and of depression and of a number of related disorders. But more recently it's been identified that actually this is part and parcel of the impact, or it's a result of the impact of having diabetes, because just about every aspect of your lifestyle affects your diabetes, and diabetes can affect so many other aspects of lifestyle. then almost like no other condition, it has the potential to impact on your overall well-being. So diabetes distress describes or acknowledges that having diabetes can have psychological impacts. And the reason for including it into the book was, one, to provide some reassurance that if you do suffer from anxiety or degree of depression, that's almost to be expected. But also, because it's related to diabetes, then the things that you can do to minimize the impact of diabetes on your life will also help reduce those levels of distress.
Now, your 6-point plan is motivational, but also designed to be guilt-free. So how important is it to be realistic?
As I said earlier, changes to lifestyle have to be changes forever. So if they're not realistic, they won't last. I'm sure many people have tried various diets or various other exercise programs that were completely unrealistic, and by definition, if they're unrealistic, you do it for a while and then you stop. And I've experienced that too. So my aim has been to help people identify the changes that they realistically can make. And if you can identify 3 or 4 relatively small changes, then that can have quite a big initial impact without almost you noticing. So for example, stopping buying fruit juice and drinking water instead. It's something that's quite easy to do. And if having done that, you see, well, actually, I'm losing a little bit of weight, my glucose levels are falling, that might motivate you then to try something that is perhaps a bit more of a challenge, but equally realistic.
So it's estimated that a person with type 2 diabetes will need to lose 15 kilograms, that's 2.5 stone, in order to completely reverse their diabetes. That sounds like a lot?
It is quite a lot, and this has come from studies which have looked at people who've been able to reverse their diabetes and the average weight that has been associated with reversal. I think the important thing to realize, however, is that if you are overweight, any loss in weight, however small, will be beneficial. And if you need to lose 15 kilograms in weight, rather than focusing on that, then just setting yourself a smaller initial goal and working towards that is a much more realistic way of approaching it. And even if one doesn't lose all of that weight, if one, say, loses only 4 or 5 kilograms, that in itself will have significant beneficial effects. It may not lead to complete reversal of diabetes, but it will mean that that person will find it much easier to control their diabetes, their health outcomes will be much better, and they will feel much better as well.
Well, in the book, you suggest very, very small steps, such as cutting out your chocolate during weekdays.
Again, these are just examples of the sort of things that will make a difference. If like me, you really like chocolate, then you will find it very, very difficult to completely, never eating chocolate ever again. So generally, I never say never, especially if there's something that you like. But if you can learn to use things like chocolate as what they used to be, an occasional treat, rather than part of your regular diet, that will, a relatively small change that hopefully most people would find able to make, will potentially make a big difference.
And again, in the book, the importance of exercise, but you make that very realistic too, don't you?
I think the key is that in order to lose weight, then what's important is that you have to take in less energy than you use up, i.e. the amount of calories that you eat has to be less than the amount of energy that you use up. And given that in our modern society, we tend not only to be eating too much, but actually, like we are now, sitting on a couch, not moving for long periods of time, it makes it so much more difficult. The evidence is that just getting up and moving around, just going for short walks, even using the bus rather than driving to work because you have to walk to the stop and from the stop at the other end, anything that gets you walking a little bit more will help.
I love your very simple food chart that you have in this book. How easy is it to follow?
The food chart is just a suggestion of the sort of things that ideally you should eat less of, and the sort of things that you can afford to eat more of without affecting your diabetes control. So again, it comes down to what your own individual preferences are as to how easy it is to follow. A relatively simple change that I suggest is, for example, that in most cases breakfast cereals, if they're not very high in sugar, they're very high in refined carbohydrate, which to your body is sugar within 15 minutes of eating. So trying to avoid breakfast cereals and find alternatives that are not so high in sugar for breakfast is something that I would invite people to consider making that change. Now, if you're not too fussed about breakfast cereals, but you've eaten them because you always have and you were brought up to, then you may find it quite easy to change to a breakfast based, say, on unsweetened yogurts or scrambled eggs. Whereas if you really love your sugar puffs, to pick a particularly bad example, you're not going to find it so easy. So the aim is to just give people suggestions and for them then to adapt those and to use the ones that they think will work best for them.
For years, patients with diabetes have been officially encouraged to cut down on fat, but to eat more starchy carbohydrates. You want to reverse this, so why?
It is certainly the case that the traditional advice for people with diabetes is to base all their meals on starchy carbohydrates. And while I think that was done for the best of intentions, I think that inadvertently it has made it far more difficult for people to control their diabetes and control their glucose levels because starchy carbohydrates are turned into sugar. Now, there are some carbohydrates which are absolutely fine, but they tend to be the less refined carbohydrates, things like wholemeal bread, wholemeal rice, and vegetables with a lot of fiber in. Because there the carbohydrates are absorbed much more slowly. But if I give a particular example of, say, a jacket potato, which until recently I've seen as being suggested as a good, healthy, nutritious meal for someone with diabetes, potato is almost all starch. When it's been in the oven for that period of time, it's almost been broken down into sugar. And a large jacket potato is not too different from eating a large bowl of sugar, because by the time it's got into your system, it will very quickly be sugar, and it will raise your blood glucose to really quite a high level. And I've seen people who've fed this experience back to me. They thought they were doing the right thing because they were following standard advice. So what I'm trying to do is to suggest that yes, we all need some carbohydrates, and I don't advocate that people should go on very low carbohydrate diets or anything like that, but just be aware of the types of carbohydrate that will push your sugar level up quite quickly, and to try and minimize those.
So you're not advocating that people should simply just go on a diet like the Atkins diet?
Certainly not. The Atkins diet is a very low carbohydrate diet, almost zero carbohydrate diet, and a very high fat diet. I don't advocate that diet or any other particular diet, and I would urge people not to follow any of those sorts of diets.
What changes have you seen in your own patients since you started to advise them to restrict their carbohydrates?
In those who've been able to make changes that fit in, which are realistically that fit in with what they've been able to do, then actually quite significant changes. I've seen people who've lost very large amounts of weight just by adopting the sort of suggestions that I've included in the book. I've seen people who've been on insulin for many years been able to come off insulin altogether and still maintain reasonable control of their diabetes in a way that I really wouldn't have thought was possible just 5 years ago. And what that's really highlighted to me is that if people are able to make relatively small changes to their diet, into the way that they eat, then it can be far more effective than any type of medication, including insulin. And it really does highlight that if you've got type 2 diabetes and you find that you are now on insulin, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you would have been told, well, you need insulin for life. Actually, that isn't necessarily the case.
In the book, you have a sort of 10-minute consultation, which is like an action plan. How does that help people?
Well, this is something that I found myself discussing with more and more people, and I was asking the same questions. And it was basically a very simple, to get a very simple idea about what their daily diet was like. So I'd start off by saying, well, what do you have typically for breakfast? And very commonly the answer would be, I have a bowl of cereal, maybe with a glass of fruit juice and then a couple of slices of toast. What do you have for lunch? Generally a sandwich or a baguette, maybe with a piece of fruit. And evening meals would very commonly be quite heavy in carbohydrates, things like a jacket potato, pasta, or a rice-based dish. And what I would then do is suggest alternatives to each of those that would hopefully be changes that someone could make without too much disruption, but which would quite significantly reduce the impact of what they're eating on their blood glucose levels.
You would describe this book as a book of hope, a book of change, a look to the future. How would you describe it?
My great hope is that for someone with type 2 diabetes reading the book, that it will be all of those. It will certainly provide them with hope. It will certainly provide them with some suggestions as to changes that they can make to ensure that they have a healthier future.
Dr. David Cavan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.